Hi everybody, Jorge here, and today I want to talk about the subtle art of speaking truth to bullshit and staying civil in the process. Here's the thing. We all have to do a lot of uncomfortable truth-telling in our lives, both personal and professional lives, and most of the time it's really hard to stay civil when the truth we have to tell goes against some predominant social conditioning or against predominant societal norms and expectations, when it exposes institutionalized and normalized forms of oppression, when it kind of challenges industry conventions, in professional contexts, when it runs counter to the majority's opinion, or the worst case scenario, when the truth we have to tell challenges the either-or framings so prevalent in our culture, like you're either for guns or you're against guns, you're either pro-life or you're pro-choice. It's also hard to stay civil when we have to respond to rhetoric that dehumanizes someone, or the rhetoric that diminishes the inherent worth or the inherent human dignity or the divinity of some people. It's really hard to stay civil in those conversations because, speaking truth to bullshit is in and of itself hard, because the amount of energy and time required to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. It's kind of it's called the bullshit asymmetry principle, and it was coined by Italian programmer Alberto Brandolini, and it's been picked up by many people who research bullshit, because bullshit is is a subject of study in philosophy, also in social science. So because it's actually a very relevant phenomenon in today's society. And so refuting bullshit with truth is in itself hard enough. But staying civil as you're refuting someone's bullshit is even harder. But we really need to master this art, to master our ability to stay civil and confident and curious and grounded in those difficult but important conversations, because that's the only way to lead those conversations effectively. If you respond to people with anger and self-righteousness, they stop hearing you. It just doesn't work. There's no way you can effect and lasting and meaningful change in people's attitudes and their beliefs and their behaviors, as horrific as those might be, if you're not being civil with them in this conversation. So, for me, this skill of speaking truth to bullshit and staying civil at the same time is crucial in my work around intersectional social justice. I'm involved in this work as an artist, as a storyteller, but that's not the only way to get involved with this work. So this is such an important skill that it is absolutely required for everybody who is a social justice activist, who does some work around it, and there are so many ways to get involved, and I think it's our collective responsibility. We all have to do this work, but it is really important to have the skill of speaking just to bullshit and being civil at the same time when you're doing this work. And I wanted to talk about it with y'all for quite a long time, but I got inspired basically to shoot this video today because of a very, very fresh and illustrative experience that I had yesterday. So here's the thing. Here's a kind of backstory for this video. About 2 years ago, I met a girl on Instagram. She's very attractive, super smart. I like her a lot. And as it turned out, we live in the same city. So, after meeting on Instagram and chatting over there and then emailing each other, basically we met in real life. And she was surprised to know that I'm also Russian, that we both live in Moscow, because you can't tell that readily from my Instagram page. And so I really I was really interested in the communication with her because she was so smart, so critically aware, so self-aware. She kind of traveled all around the world, and she had those expanded horizons, those critical thinking skills. She was a progressive Christian, the kind of Christian that I had never met in Russia living my entire life here before. And so, quite often through this period of 2 years that we have known each other, we were talking about why people leave church in this country, and why I left church personally a few years ago. And that is always such an interesting conversation because she didn't leave church. So yesterday, again, we went into this conversation, and I gave her my arguments. I gave her, the reasons why I left church, because church, as I grew up, as I grew older, I realized that church got undisguisedly political in the recent years here in Russia, and it became obvious, increasingly obvious to me, that it endorsed this kind of corrupt, hateful, and ineffective political leadership that we have in this country. And that was such a big turn off for me. And I also said, you know what, I don't want to be part of the church that as an institution, as a system, fails to practice the values that Jesus modeled for us in his earthly journey. And what are those values? Courage, integrity, speaking truth to power, speaking truth to bullshit. You cannot hear about those values when you go to churches here in Russia. You cannot hear about those values in sermons. But you can hear about kind of humility being, a euphemism for scarcity. So this is a church that basically keeps people in shame and scarcity instead of empowering them, instead of encouraging them, instead of making them actually follow the teachings of Jesus. And I also told her that I just don't trust the church that doesn't practice historical accountability around its mistakes, because it doesn't own those mistakes in the first place. And that is a failure of courage. And so, in order to clarify what I meant here, we just we started talking about this powerful concept from the work of Brené Brown, which is owning a story. So what is owning a story? We all have stories, personal stories, collective stories, relational stories. We all have stories in our lives that are not really, kind of rip-roaring, successful, fun, fast, and easy. But we all have stories that are quite hard and that, are basically full of mistakes and that trigger a lot of negative emotions for us when we remember about them. But here's the thing. If we own that story, if we own those mistakes, if we own that story in its entirety, then we can pick up a pen and write a different ending for it. That's how Brené Brown puts it, brilliantly. If we own a story, we can become its authors. We can pick up a pen and write a different ending for it, the ending that we believe should be right for it. But if we don't own our stories, if we continue living in denial of our stories, then we remain characters trapped in those stories. So instead of us owning that story, this story keeps owning us. And, this very accurately describes many individual experiences that we have. If we don't own a mistake, for example, that we did in a relationship, how can we improve that relationship? How can we move forward with that relationship? How we can move forward with building love or trust with that person if we didn't own our own mistake in the first place? But also, this concept very accurately describes many historical phenomena, many historical stories, collective stories that we have. Because there is no way we can change the ending of a story until we own this story. in today's America, for example, there is still so much institutionalized racism because the majority of white folks still haven't owned the story of white supremacy, the dehumanization of African Americans. That's part of the history of America as a country. And this is a striking contrast to Germany, the country who basically stood behind the two world wars. And this country these days has the courage to own the horrors that went out of those world wars, the Holocaust, for example. Germany still, as a country, it still pays reparations to Jews. There's been, more than 70 years after the World War II ended. But Germany still pays reparations to Jews because it owns its mistakes as a country. Despite the great discontent of many German taxpayers these days who believe that the horrors of Nazism are not their fault and they shouldn't be responsible for that. But Germany as a country, as a nation, as a government, still practices historical accountability around what it did, no matter how long ago that was. Then again, this is such a great example, and this is such a contrast compared, to Turkey, for example, and the situation around Armenian genocide. Because Armenian genocide, as well as it might have been researched today, it is still denied by the governments of Turkey and Azerbaijan. They behave like the government, the country as a system, as a whole, behaves like this has never happened. And so millions of Armenians around the world live with this intergenerational trauma of having that happen to their ancestors and still not having this acknowledged. So when it comes to the Christian church, to our church, the truth is that at some point in history, it became an institution exercising real power in Western societies. And it still does exercise some power, not nearly as much power as it used to have, but still does. And so, like any kind of power leadership, our church did make mistakes. So our church, Christian church, did do things historically that were completely out of line with the teachings of Jesus. And I'm talking about the Inquisition or the Crusades here, those things, like those historical events and historical processes where religious pretexts from our religion were used to justify violence and oppression. Thank God those things are acknowledged by our church. But one of the worst historical stories that our church still fails to own is the story of LGBT discrimination. This is the story of homophobia, heterosexism, and homophobic violence. My fellow Christians, this is the truth about where we come from and what we have historically done. Our church and some parts of its doctrine based on misinterpretations of ancient biblical texts have been the root cause of the marginalization, oppression, and dehumanization inflicted on LGBT people for centuries. And I know that today there are many progressive Christians. There are many LGBT activists among Christians, myself included. There are even LGBT activists among clergy in many denominations. There are people in our church who have the courage, who practice the value that Jesus modeled for us, who have the courage to own and fix the mistakes of our church with their work. But our church as a whole, our church as an institution, still hasn't owned the story of homophobia and heterosexism that it has sponsored for centuries. And in doing so, it fails to practice one of the most basic Christian values, which is courage. This is what Jesus gloriously modeled for us in his earthly journey. And so here in Russia, where things in church have become particularly politicized and where homophobia and heterosexism are among the major pillars supporting our political propaganda, I no longer feel the need to go to church at all. Because when I go to church as a Christian, I want to connect with Jesus. I want to meet Jesus there. And what I realized is that Jesus is not at that church. Jesus is not at the church where people different from majority are made to feel like they don't belong or they aren't worthy enough. And let me tell you, when in the years of the research that I did for my book, I read interviews of LGBT people who grew up religious here in Russia. Like it was just horrific. Those people were broken in ways, that I had never thought were possible. And, these days, after knowing all of that, after knowing all the truth about homophobia, I don't want to go to the church that keeps breaking people and shaming people and marginalizing people because of who they are. And, this is not something I'm making up because, when I my divorce with church started happening, I was thinking, maybe it's just the parish in my neighborhood, the parish where I always went to growing up. Maybe it is just here where people are so hateful and so narrow-minded. Maybe I need to go somewhere else because, Moscow is such a huge city. We have hundreds of churches. And so I tried going to different churches, but 95% of the time, when I went to, attend a service or, have communion or anything, and I could hear a sermon being delivered in church, 95% of the time, there was either sexism or racism or homophobia or rationalization of trauma or some kind of really dangerous bullshit in the rhetoric that was being delivered from the pulpit. And so every time I heard that, I just realized Jesus is not here. I came here to meet Jesus and Jesus is not here because his values are not honored or practiced here. And the thing that traumatized me the most is that when people heard that, everybody just accepted that. People just listened with those humble expressions on their face. No one walked out of the church where sexist remarks were being given. No one walked away of the church. And so I walked away of the church. I just walked away, and I don't regret it. Absolutely. I do believe that I can be with Jesus in outside church, because if church is something like that, Jesus is not there either. I'm not there, but Jesus is not there either. So I do want to come back to church, but I do want to come back to a different kind of church. Probably when I leave Russia and, settle somewhere else, I want to come back to Christian church that is inclusive, that, that makes everyone feel like be here, be seen, belong. The church where everybody has a seat at the table and a voice. And kind of interesting observation here is that when I went to Spain, I went to churches there, and I went to churches a lot. Even though I'm not Catholic, but I went to Catholic churches in Spain because there were no other churches available. But the thing that really surprises me in hindsight is that for all this kind of conservatism that Catholicism is kind of notorious for, when I was in Spain and when I went to Catholic churches and I listened to sermons and I listened to things that were being said in the church, I never heard this amount of bigotry and hate and shaming as I keep hearing here in Russia. So I don't think that it has to do with the denomination, but I don't think it has to do with religion at all. I think it rather has to do with, some larger social culture that in Spain is so much different from the culture we have here in Russia. And so I do want to come back to this kind of church that can be inclusive, that can be accepting of everybody, that doesn't just tolerate people but celebrates people. But I will not go back to the church that, avoids this uncomfortable topic of homophobia or doubles down on its homophobia and heterosexism, because that is a failure of courage and a failure of integrity. And that is a major turn off for me because it absolutely violates my Christianity. So coming back to the conversation that I had with my friend yesterday, here's the thing. Me and her, over the previous 2 years of communicating, we only briefly touched this topic of homophobia and heterosexism because it looked like, she traveled a lot around Europe, and from what she said, I sort of assumed that she's kind of LGBT friendly, and so, basically, even though homophobia and heterosexism are among the main issues that my book addresses, me and her have almost never talked about it. Maybe that's because when she reached out to me initially on Instagram, we were talking about her relationship experience that had to do with, it's very, very tough. It had to do with emotional abuse and gaslighting and depression and all those things. And so we, in our subsequent communication, we mainly talked about those things, but we kind of it's not that we voluntarily stayed away from that topic, but it sort of never came up in our conversations. But yesterday it came up because I said, this is the reason why I left church and why I will not come back to the church that behaves like that towards the LGBT community. And then in response to that, she tells me, but Jorge, it's clearly written in the Bible that Sodomites will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so when I hear that, I'm like, oh, and then she adds, Jesus said that. And so when I hear this last phrase, Jesus said that, I'm just completely shocked because here's the thing. I find myself in a complete shame storm because I did this research on homophobia and heterosexism. I did this research for my book, and I grew critical awareness about homophobia and heterosexism. And the first part of critical awareness is when you study where this problem comes from, when you study the root causes of this cultural issue. And so the root causes of homophobia and heterosexism are misinterpretations of religious texts. So I studied that for almost 1.5 years, and I learned a lot about those passages in the Bible, like everywhere in the Bible, those passages that are being referred to as a justification for homophobia and heterosexism. But I never came across any quote from Jesus where he said, Sodomites won't inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so I find myself in a shame storm as a researcher because I think, oh my gosh, it's written somewhere in the Bible, and and I missed it. Oh my gosh. But then, again, this is kind of the benefit of having shame resilience skills, because after a few seconds of being in the shame storm, critical awareness starts to catch up, and I'm like, and I tell her, really? Please give me a reference. Where is it written in the Bible? Where did Jesus say that? I haven't seen that ever. And then she takes some time. She thanks her. Oh, Jorge, I'm sorry. Jesus never said that. It was Apostle Paul who said that. So he wrote that in the Epistle to Romans. And I'll be like, oh my God, this thing I know how to address. And that's the moment of truth for me, because that's the moment where I prepare to walk out in the arena and be really vulnerable and speak truth to bullshit. And I feel especially vulnerable because she's not the kind of a person who had, who over the years struck me as homophobic. I didn't expect that from her, from someone who has such developed critical thinking skills. But then again, when I hear this BS that homosexuals won't inherit the kingdom of heaven, it's hard for me to stay civil, because when I did the research on homophobia and heterosexism, aside from the root causes and the mechanisms of those things, I also learned about the impact, about the numbers and the data, and all the consequences that homophobia and heterosexism have in our society up to this day. And so when I hear this argument, and especially when I hear the certainty around that argument that homosexuals won't inherit the kingdom of heaven, I remember what this kind of thinking and what this kind of belief has historically led to, and what it still leads to. What I remember, is the number of homeless kids in today's America. Almost one half of homeless teenagers in the streets of major American cities are LGBTQ. Those are the kids who are being thrown out, who are being kicked out of their homes by their own families when those families find out that they're gay or trans. So we're not talking about some third world country a million years ago. This is what America looks like today. What I remember, another thing I remember about are concentration camps here in Russia, in a certain region of this country. That, this information broke into the news some 2 years ago, that there are concentration camps. There are, special police officers who hunt for gay men on dating apps, and then they, set up fake dates with those men. Then they kidnap them, bring them to the concentration camps, torture them, mutilate them. Some of those gay men are murdered. And so it's all, of course, a state-sponsored and state-covered violence. And, those people, receive their salaries from taxpayers' money, my money included. So I'm also among those people who sponsor homophobic violence in this country. Another thing I remember about is the abuse of LGBT people in places of detention all around the world, how widespread that is. Another thing I remember is laws of death penalty that exist for adult consensual same-sex relationships in 5 or 4 Middle Eastern countries today, not a million years ago, today. Another thing I remember about is how, even in Europe, like in the midst of Europe, in the most kind of LGBT accepting region of the world, last year it happened in Austria, when Austrian authorities denied asylum to a young gay man from Afghanistan because, in their judgment, he didn't look gay enough. So, they told him, you're masculine. We're told that you fight with your roommates, so you're not effeminate. We don't believe that you're gay. And so they denied asylum. They denied this person asylum from the state-sponsored violence of his native country. And finally, I remember again about those anonymous interviews of gay kids who grew up Christian here in Russia, and how for years they were brainwashed into self-hatred and depression and shame by the church, and how some of them attempted suicide. So, when I remember all of that, when I remember, these data from my research, my empathy skills kick in, and I feel the pain and the trauma and the powerlessness of LGBT people with them. But that's only for a moment, because then I start feeling anger. I start feeling, this epic anger at my church and its hypocrisy and the horrors this hypocrisy has been enabling. And so when I'm expected to speak truth to this argument that Sodomites want to inherit the kingdom of heaven, I don't really feel like staying civil. When I remember the numbers and the data and all, those images come up in my mind, about millions of ruined LGBT lives, instead, toxic masculinity rises up in me. And what I really want to do is I want to lay into people and use my research data, as a weapon to just hit them over the head, to shame them around their heterosexual privilege, their hate and their bigotry and their ignorance, and just, emotionally annihilate them. Pretty much the same way they're trying to emotionally annihilate LGBT people with this attitude and these beliefs. Because what can be more shaming and more emotionally destructive when a person comes to church because they want to be with God and belong to God, and they come to church and they're told, you won't inherit the kingdom of heaven because of who you are. So I don't really feel like staying civil in these conversations. But then, again, my critical awareness catches up. And, I tell myself, Jorge, your anger is very understandable, but don't let it out because it doesn't work. This is not how you do these conversations. So, instead of telling her, oh my gosh, you're so ignorant. I thought better of you. I thought you were smart. And now you're saying this stupid, hateful thing. So before I shame her for saying this stupid thing out loud, what I realized is that I believed the same stupid thing for the majority of my life. Actually, before I began my research for the book 7 years ago, And so then again, I began this research because like what triggered my kind of awakening, becoming woke in these questions around social justice is it was my first trip to Spain. When I traveled to Spain for the first time, it was my first travel to big Europe. And when I saw how accepting and inclusive society could be, not only to LGBT people, but also to other groups of people that have been historically marginalized and discriminated. And so now I'm, that was at the age of 25. Now that I'm 31, I realized that I could still believe the same stupid thing, that homosexuals would inherit the kingdom of heaven. Not because I would be stupid as a person, but because I wouldn't have been exposed to the evidence that would have reality checked and disproved my beliefs. Because that was it. In Spain, I saw evidence around homophobia and heterosexism that completely challenged my notions. And another piece of evidence that I saw there that was, personally important for me was the evidence about economic opportunity. Then again, for me, it worked pretty much the same way as it worked with homophobia, heterosexism. I come to a country and I see that in this country, unlike in Russia, I, as a healthcare worker, as a doctor, could be middle class. That I could make a career. And, it completely blew up my mind because prior to that moment, my horizons, including my professional horizons, had been confined to Russia. And so I believe that unless you have connections or bribe your seniors, there's no way to make a successful academic career or to make it to a middle-class life as a doctor. Because that had been my experience in Russia, the country where healthcare industry was underfunded and corrupt to the marrow of its bones, and where talent wasn't valued at all. But in Spain, it was a whole different ballgame. And so when I was exposed to evidence, I stopped seeing those things that I had been accustomed to in Russia as immutable and inevitable. And so when it comes to heterosexism and homophobia, I understand that my beliefs changed because of being exposed to the evidence first, and then following my curiosity to research those hard issues and uncomfortable issues. But most people who grew up here in Russia or in oppressive cultures anywhere else, they do not follow their curiosity even when they get exposed to evidence. Because my friend, she traveled to Europe, much more times than I did. Because she is higher class and she had more money growing up, and so she had far more travels than I had. And so there's no doubt that she had seen far more LGBT inclusivity than I have. But somehow, it didn't prompt her to research and reality check all this homophobic bullshit that we had been fed, since we were toddlers, that we had been fed as a kind of biblical dogma. And so, just because today, she's about my age, but today she still says this stupid and hateful thing about LGBT people doesn't necessarily mean that she is stupid and hateful. And so that is the moment for me to walk into this conversation with a grounded confidence, with a confidence grounded in my research and in my critical awareness, and with civility and curiosity and empathy. And so instead of just following my anger and my frustration and just laying into her, instead of making just an angry face and adopting this kind of superior macho/researcher position and just dominating over a woman who obviously lacks knowledge and critical awareness. Instead of that, I put on this kind of nice American face and I tell her, let's say more. Just say more. You claim that it's clearly written in the Bible that Sodomites won't inherit the kingdom of heaven. So say more. And she gets confused because, she understands that I obviously disagree with her on this issue. But at the same time, instead of interrupting her and laying into her, I encourage her to say more. That's completely countercultural. That's not what people can often see here in Russia. And so she gets real vulnerable, and she goes like, but wow, this is written in the Epistle to Romans. It's sort of clear that Apostle Paul writes that. And at this point, I ask her, and who do you think are referred to as Sodomites in this passage? So you quoted the passage, you said Sodom is one in the kingdom of heaven. Who do you think I'm being referred to? And she goes like, well, of course, homosexuals. And then I ask her, why do you think so? And she's, well, that's because the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about homosexuals. And I'm like, I get that. I also believe that for the majority of my life. Like, let's check this out. And and this is the kind of privilege that we have these days, because I just pick up my phone. Like in this era of technology, we can just pick up a phone and reality check what's written in the Bible. So you don't need to go to a church or a library to get access to the biblical text. And so I open up this passage and the book of Genesis, that is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, very short, maybe about 2 pages. And I tell her, no, let's read this together. Let's check this out. Let's read this together right now. And we read this, and then I ask her, so you just told me that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about homosexuals. Do you see any mention of homosexuality, like any mention of the word homosexual in this story? And she's like, no, but it's kind of implied that these people who wanted to kind of rape these angels are homosexuals. And I go like, really? But why do you think it's implied that? Because what we see here is in the story is an attempt of a gang rape. And so, these days, for example, there are people in prisons who are not homosexuals, who are straight, but who engage in sexual relationships with inmates and who, sometimes rape new inmates when they come in. So this kind of same-sex sexual relationships are also practiced, in some countries in the military as a form of domination, but by men who are straight. So why do you think that just because an attempt of a gang rape, kind of same-sex gang rape, is described in the story, why do you think this is a story about homosexuals? And she goes like, oh my gosh, I don't know, I never considered that. And I say, well, it's because it's just not there. Like, this story has nothing to say about homosexuality, and it's barely surprising because in biblical times, people just didn't understand things like sexual orientation or gender identity. They couldn't conceptualize those terms. Just like they didn't understand that Earth was round, not flat. Just like they didn't understand, the immune system and the brain biochemistry. It's just because at that historical point, people didn't have tools to discover and explore and measure real things accurately. She's an English teacher, so she is very, just like me, she's very fond of languages. And I tell her, even from the linguistic point of view, we cannot claim that Bible has anything to say about homosexuality because there was no word for in Hebrew or Aramaic or ancient Greek or any of the languages from which we translate Bible these days. There's no word for homosexual because people who wrote the Bible, they didn't conceptualize that. They didn't understand that at the moment. And then she goes on to ask, but Jorge, then why is this story in the Bible? Why do you think, the writers of the Bible kind of considered it worthy of being included? And I go like, I don't know for sure because I wasn't the one who wrote Bible, but I think obviously it's because this story of Sodom and Gomorrah portrays inhospitality, the inhospitality of citizens of these of Sodom, and it very unambiguously condemns an attempt of a gang rape, which makes a lot of sense. But then I tell her, there's a surprise for you, because a few books later in the Old Testament, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is being described in a far clearer way. And so I just, scroll the Bible and I give her this passage from the book of Ezekiel, this prophet who prophesied the forthcoming destruction of Jerusalem. And so in this book, it's like God is talking to Jerusalem and addressing himself to Jerusalem. And so it is said here, like God is talking to Jerusalem, and He's talking to Jerusalem in female gender, because obviously cities were female in Hebrew, and so it's like God tells Jerusalem, "This was the sin of your sister Sodom and its daughters. They were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They didn't help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. So I did away with them, as you have seen." And now, here we have it. This is the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Overfed, arrogant, and unconcerned. Didn't help the poor and the needy. So, when these days we kind of encounter this term Sodomite in the Bible or anywhere else, it makes far more sense to think about people who are overfed, arrogant, and unconcerned. People who in contemporary language we would call, the privileged, rather than think about homosexuals. And I tell her, you know what? That's probably what Apostle Paul meant when he said that they want to inherit the kingdom of heaven, and that makes a lot of sense. And she's like, wow, yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. And then I go, well, actually, that's not the case, because I know what, here's the thing, we can further explore what Apostle Paul meant in this epistle, but here's the thing. Apostle Paul was a human. He could make mistakes. And the thing I know for sure is that Jesus, as God, didn't ban anyone from the kingdom of heaven. No matter what people did in their past, you could be a publican, you could be a prostitute, you could be, a robber dying on a cross next to Jesus. If you repented and if you allowed Jesus to lead you, if you allowed Jesus into your heart, Jesus would accept you. And so to say that some people will not inherit the kingdom of heaven because of who they are, it is completely out of line with the idea of Jesus, with this whole idea of our religion. And so then I go and say, in this passage, in the Epistle to Romans, Sodomites is just one of the translations. You can, see other translations, and there you will see that this word is being translated as effeminate. In some other translations, it's translated as homosexuals. And then I go, but do you know what is the original word? Why is this such discrepancy? Because effeminate is not the same thing as homosexual, and as we can see, homosexual is not the same thing as sodomite. So why do we see this discrepancy between translations? And that is because the original scripture in Greek had the word malakos. And malakos literally means soft. So how do we translate that? How do we translate, what does it mean soft? What is a soft person? What is that? And importantly, it is the only place throughout entire scripture where the word malakos is used to describe people. So we cannot reality check its meaning, even its metaphorical meaning. We cannot reality check it. So if we cannot reality check it, if we cannot even understand the meaning of this word correctly, how can we claim that anything is clear in the Bible around that, or that anything is clear in this passage for that matter? Another word that is, commonly used in those passages that are being referred to as a justification for homophobia is arsenokoites. Arsenokoites, is another word that Paul just coined, because it was not even though it is a kind of Greek word, a word that sounds Greek, but it is not the word that has ever been used in ancient Greek to describe homosexuals or homosexual relationships. So with this kind of weak evidence that we have, there is no way we can be certain about who will inherit the kingdom of heaven and who won't. And I don't think that we humans have enough authority to decide that anyway. And I don't think, that as a consequence we have the authority to decide who belongs in the church and who doesn't. And finally, it makes no sense at all to believe that God makes people a certain way and then denies them the kingdom of heaven because of who they are, not because of what they choose. And so there at this point begins the final round of our debate where we basically bump into this very important, very common issue related to empathy. Because she says, well, I don't believe that God makes people gay. I've always believed, and I still believe, that they choose to be gay, that, kind of homosexuality or transgenderness is a choice. And then I tell her, so, wow, that's interesting. So tell me, please, when did you choose to be straight? So if you believe that sexual orientation is a choice, at what age did you decide that you are straight? She got confused and responded nothing. This is how you remind people about their privilege and about their privilege. And then I tell her that although there is an ongoing debate on whether sexuality or gender identity stem more from genetics, more from our biology, or more from socialization, there is already an evidence-based scientific consensus that they're not a choice and they cannot be changed. Historical experiments like, conversion therapy, this experiment that was kind of purported to change people's sexual orientation, proved that sexual orientation cannot be changed. And we got this evidence at a great cost, at the cost of damaging tens of thousands of LGBT lives with this conversion therapy, and, wasting thousands of dollars and millions of dollars, because some of those programs were government funded in America. But it was the definitive piece of evidence that as society we should stop seeking to change gay people, but we should work to change the homophobia and heterosexism so deeply embedded in our culture. And then I finally say, if you still believe that homosexuality is a choice, then tell me, please, why would people choose to be something if they know that it makes them subject to oppression, marginalization, and dehumanization? If that were a choice, why would anyone make it, given the consequences? And then she's like, wow, I've never considered that. And I'll go like, you're not alone. You're not alone. I also believed for the majority of my life that being gay is a choice. But that was before I read those interviews of gay and trans people, and before I myself got to talk to them and hear their stories on Instagram, because that's what I've been doing over the recent years. And here's the thing. Here's this hugely important thing related to empathy. Unlike I did when I was younger, today I'm no longer willing to pretend that I can understand the experiences of people different from me better than they do. I'm not going to do that from my position of privilege. Instead, I will listen to people's lived experiences and believe those experiences exactly as they tell them to me. Because that is perspective taking. This is one of the basic skills of empathy. And that applies to any dimension of inequality. So I gave her a clear example of that in how I accepted her female perspective on marriage. Even though my perspective on marriage as a man is different, and we frequently kind of debate that. But I told her, I just accepted it because you look at marriage through a female lens, and I look at it through a male lens, and I can't just put down my lens to pick up your lens. No, I can't do that. My lens is soldered to my face. As a man, this is how I see the world. But what I can do is I can believe your feelings and your experiences, and how when you're in a relationship with a guy and that guy doesn't propose to you, over some 5 years, you start thinking that he doesn't love you enough, that you're unlovable, and start making up all those stories. But to me, it doesn't feel that way. But that's because we have different lenses. And so I told her it's the same thing with gay and trans people. We cannot assume that homosexuality or transgenderness is a choice when we are straight. When we are cisgender, when we have not lived through it. And so she looks so deeply shaken. And she says, that makes a lot of sense. I need to reflect more. Thank you for this conversation, and let's come back to it soon. And I'm like, you know what, you're welcome. It's an important conversation that we need to be having as Christians. If we're not having it at church, at least we need to be having it with each other, because we don't want our faith to be bankrupt on its own terms. So this experience showed me how crucial staying civil, it showed me, for an umpteenth time, how crucial staying civil is for the outcome of a conversation that starts with flagrant bullshit, and how transformative vulnerability and curiosity and empathy can be, even though they're damn hard to practice in today's culture. And so, the takeaway message from this story is, every time life gives you an opportunity to speak truth to bullshit, jump at it. Just don't lose it. Don't miss out on that opportunity. Don't be silent. Don't kind of stay away from those conversations because of your privilege. No, walk into those conversations and speak truth to bullshit. But remember to stay civil. Remember to stay civil. I'm not talking about, respectability politics here. I'm not talking that we should I'm not saying that we should fit in with those who hold unacknowledged privilege and therefore behave or believe in an oppressive or overtly hateful way. No, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that we, in doing those conversations and in leading those conversations, we should ourselves practice the values that we are preaching. If we're preaching about empathy and acceptance and love for everyone, then we should operationalize those values in the way that we lead those conversations. Because if you just lay into people and shame them for being homophobic, this, it happens to no end. You will not change their beliefs because you do not model yourself what you're preaching to them. So I do hope you take this story constructively. Now, please tell me, what are your experiences of speaking truth to bullshit and staying civil? Please share them in comments. I would love to hear from y'all. And also, if you find this video insightful, inspiring, and helpful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends. As always, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time on Horror's YouTube channel. Keep telling the truth, show up, be brave, stay curious, and take care. Bye.